For 3 years, he was the best they had. And nobody ever knew his name. I'm restructuring senior leadership. Vanessa Camden will be stepping into Director of Key Accounts.
Optics matter more than people think. Your account list needed a fresh face.
I'll clear my desk.
Three years later, they found out exactly whose desk they'd asked him to clear.
For 3 years, Daniel Reyes was the best salesman the company had ever seen. He wore the same worn-out jacket to work every day. He packed his daughter's lunch every morning before sunrise. And every single quarter, he broke another record, quietly, without asking for credit. Then the chairman promoted his own daughter over him. No warning, no thank you. Just a new name on the office door that used to have his. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply said 4 words. I'll clear my desk. What nobody in that building knew, what they were about to find out, was exactly whose desk they'd just asked him to clear. The alarm went off at 5:10 a.m., the same way it had for 3 years, and Daniel Reyes was already awake before it finished its first cycle. He silenced it with a tap, careful not to wake the house too early, and padded down the hallway of the small 2-bedroom rental he shared with his 8-year-old daughter, Mia. By 5:30, he had her lunch packed, a turkey sandwich cut diagonally because she insisted triangles tasted better than squares, an apple, and a note folded into a small square that said, "You've got this, kiddo," in handwriting that never quite matched the neatness of his spreadsheets. By 6:15, Mia was dressed and eating cereal at the kitchen counter, while Daniel ironed the same navy button-down he'd worn to work more times than he could count. It wasn't that he didn't own other shirts. It was that this one still fit the way it had 3 years ago, and there was no reason to spend money on something new when the old one still did the job. That was Daniel's philosophy about most things. Don't spend what you don't need to spend. Don't say what doesn't need to be said. Just do the work, and let the work speak. At Camden and Holt Distribution, a mid-sized logistics and wholesale company on the edge of downtown, that philosophy had turned Daniel into a legend. The quiet kind. The kind whispered about in break rooms rather than celebrated in company newsletters. For 3 consecutive years, he had been the top-performing account manager in the entire sales division, closing more contracts, retaining more clients, and generating more revenue than anyone else on a floor of 42 salespeople. He didn't have the corner office. He didn't have the company car. He had a cubicle near the copier that jammed twice a day, a laminated photo of Mia taped to his monitor, and a stack of client folders organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive. He'd taken the job 5 years earlier, right after his wife passed away, when he needed something stable enough to raise a daughter alone and flexible enough to let him leave by 4:45 every day for school pickup. Camden and Holt offered exactly that. In exchange, Daniel gave them everything he had during the hours he was there. No long lunches, no office gossip, no politics. Just numbers that kept climbing, quarter after quarter, while he kept his head down and his mouth shut. The man who ran Camden and Holt was Richard Camden, the company's chairman and majority owner, a silver-haired 64-year-old who had inherited the business from his father and spent the last 2 decades expanding it into a regional powerhouse. Richard liked to describe himself as a people person, the kind of executive who remembered birthdays and shook every hand in the building on his way to his office. But Daniel had learned, over 5 years of quiet observation, that Richard's warmth had a very specific shape. It curved toward people who could be useful to him, and it curved hardest of all toward his only daughter, Vanessa. Vanessa Camden had joined the company 18 months earlier, fresh off a business degree and a brief, unremarkable stint at a marketing firm 2 states away. She was smart in the way people are smart when they've never had to struggle for anything. Quick with a pitch, comfortable in a boardroom, utterly convinced that confidence and competence were the same thing. She'd been given the title of Senior Account Strategist on her first day, a title that had taken Daniel 4 years to earn through actual results. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone on the floor understood the arrangement. Vanessa was being groomed. The only question was for what and how fast. Daniel didn't resent her, not exactly. What bothered him, quietly, in the part of his chest he never let show on his face, was the way Richard's eyes would light up when Vanessa walked into a meeting. and how those same eyes would slide right past Daniel during quarterly reviews, even when his numbers were the ones on the slide behind him. He'd sit in the back of those meetings, watching his own work get summarized by someone else, watching Richard nod along like the results were simply the natural order of things rather than the product of a man who'd spent 5 years perfecting his craft while raising a child alone. It was on a Tuesday in early spring, during the company's quarterly all-hands meeting, that the first real crack appeared. Richard stood at the front of the conference room, clicker in hand, walking through the numbers that would eventually define the entire year. And there was Daniel's name on the slide. Renewal rate 94%, top performer D. Reyes, 3rd year running. Daniel sat near the back, as he always did, hands folded, expecting nothing more than the usual polite applause and a return to his desk. Instead, Richard clicked forward and said the sentence that would, 3 months later, change everything. And I'm pleased to announce that I'll be restructuring the senior sales leadership team, with Vanessa Camden stepping into the newly created role of Director of Key Accounts. The room applauded. Vanessa smiled and stood, gave a small wave, thanked her father for believing in her vision. Daniel clapped along with everyone else because that was what you did, and felt something quiet and cold settle into his stomach. Not surprise, exactly. He'd seen it coming for months. But something closer to recognition. The recognition that no matter how many records he broke, no matter how many nights he'd stayed late reworking a proposal after Mia was asleep, there was a ceiling in this building, with his name nowhere near it. What none of them knew, not Richard, not Vanessa, not a single person on that floor, was that Daniel Reyes hadn't taken this job because he needed the paycheck. He'd taken it because, after his wife died, he needed somewhere to put his hands, something ordinary to hold on to while grief rearranged everything else in his life. And buried 3 states away in a filing cabinet nobody at Camden and Holt had ever seen was a folder with his real last name on it, not Reyes. The name he'd quietly adopted after his wife's passing to give Mia a fresh start. But a name that, if it ever crossed Richard Camden's desk, would have changed every single conversation in that building from the very first day. For now, though, Daniel simply sat back down at his desk near the jamming copier, looked at the photo of Mia taped to his monitor, and got back to work. There would be time, later, for everything else to come out. For now, there was a client call at 2 o'clock, and Daniel Reyes never missed a call. The weeks after Vanessa's promotion moved fast, the way water moves fast right before it finds the crack in a dam. At first, the changes were small enough to dismiss. Daniel's biggest accounts, the ones he'd nurtured for years, the ones that trusted his name on an email more than they trusted the company's logo, started receiving calls from Vanessa's new assistant, requesting alignment meetings to streamline communication going forward. Daniel wasn't invited to these meetings. He simply received calendar notifications after the fact, informing him that certain accounts would now report through the Director of Key Accounts office. He said nothing. He kept working the accounts he still had, kept his numbers climbing even as his territory quietly shrank, and told himself it was a phase, that once Vanessa settled into the role, things would rebalance. He'd been patient before. He could be patient again. But patience has a shelf life, and Daniel's began to expire the day he walked into the Monday sales meeting and discovered his name had been removed from the client-facing directory on the company intranet. In its place, next to 3 of his largest accounts, was Vanessa's name and photo. When he asked IT about it, a nervous 24-year-old named Priya told him, without meeting his eyes, that the change had come directly from the director's office and that she'd just been told to update it. Daniel walked to Vanessa's new office, the one that used to belong to the VP of Operations before he'd retired, and knocked. She was on a call, waved him off with 2 fingers without breaking her sentence, and gestured for him to wait outside. He stood in the hallway for 11 minutes, watching people walk past him with the particular kind of pity reserved for someone who has clearly already lost, before she finally opened the door and said, breezily, that she'd get to it eventually, that optics matter more than people think, and that, frankly, his account list had needed a fresh face for a while now. She said it with a smile. She said it like she was doing him a favor. He went back to his desk and didn't say a word to anyone. That night, after Mia was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and quietly began documenting everything. Every reassigned account, every meeting he'd been excluded from, every email where his contributions had been folded into a team effort that conveniently excluded his name. He wasn't building a case for a lawsuit. He was simply doing what he'd always done, keeping careful, precise records, the same instinct that had made him the best account manager the company had ever had. He just didn't know yet what those records would eventually be used for. Over the following months, the humiliations grew bolder, less disguised. At a company dinner celebrating a major contract renewal, a contract Daniel had personally closed after 8 months of careful negotiation, Richard stood up to give a toast and thanked Vanessa's fresh leadership for turning around a relationship that had gone stale. Daniel sat 2 tables back, fork in hand, and felt the room's attention slide past him entirely, as if the 5 years of work that had built that relationship had simply never happened. A coworker beside him, a younger rep named Marcus, who'd always looked up to Daniel, leaned over and whispered that it was messed up, that everyone knew that was him. Daniel just nodded and kept eating. It was around this time that the first real clue slipped, though almost no one noticed it. A courier arrived at the office one Thursday afternoon carrying a thick manila envelope addressed to Daniel Reyes, marked confidential, from a law firm in Manhattan, with a name that would have made any of the executives on that floor sit up straight if they'd bothered to read it closely. Daniel signed for it at the front desk, tucked it under his arm without opening it, and walked calmly back to his cubicle. The receptionist, a chatty woman named Denise, mentioned it in passing to a coworker later that day. Some fancy law firm sent him something. Wonder what that's about. And the comment drifted through the office for exactly 1 afternoon before being forgotten. Nobody connected it to anything. Why would they? Daniel Reyes was just the quiet guy from the cubicle by the copier. But the pressure kept building. 3 weeks later, during the company's annual budget review, Vanessa proposed a restructuring plan that would eliminate the commission structure Daniel had operated under for years, replacing it with a flat salary system that conveniently capped compensation well below what his performance had historically earned. When Daniel raised concerns in the meeting, calmly, professionally, laying out the numbers that showed the plan would actually cost the company money by disincentivizing top performers, Richard cut him off mid-sentence and said, in front of the entire leadership team, that he appreciated the input, but that this decision had already been made. Vanessa didn't even look at him. She was scrolling through her phone. That night, Daniel didn't go home right away. He sat in his car in the parking garage for almost 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, doing the math on what 5 years of being invisible had actually cost him. Not in dollars, though there was plenty of that, but in the accumulated weight of being the best person in a room and never once being treated like it. He thought about Mia, asleep at home with the babysitter, and about the promise he'd made himself the day his wife died, that he would never again let his name disappear inside someone else's story. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday morning. 6 weeks after the budget meeting, Daniel arrived at his desk to find a company-wide email already sitting in his inbox, sent at 7:02 a.m., before he'd even had a chance to see it firsthand. The subject line read, Leadership Update, Key Accounts Division. The email, written by Richard himself, announced that in recognition of her outstanding leadership, Vanessa Camden would be assuming full oversight of all major account relationships company-wide, effective immediately. Daniel's name wasn't mentioned once, not as a colleague, not as a footnote, not at all. He read the email twice. Then he stood up, walked to Richard's office, and for the first time in 5 years, knocked on a door without waiting to be invited in. Richard looked up, mildly annoyed, and asked what he could do for him. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't list grievances. He simply said the 4 words that would echo through that building for the rest of the year. I'll clear my desk. Richard blinked, clearly expecting an argument, maybe even relieved not to have one. That's probably for the best, he said, already turning back to his monitor. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. Neither did Vanessa, who would find out exactly 3 years later, in the worst possible way, standing in a boardroom that no longer belonged to her family, because the manila envelope sitting unopened in Daniel's desk drawer that very morning wasn't confidential correspondence about a lawsuit. It was something far more permanent and far more devastating to the Camden family than either of them could have imagined. 3 years is a long time to wait for a chessboard to finish setting itself up, and Vanessa Camden had spent every one of them believing she'd already won the game. In the time since Daniel Reyes cleared out his cubicle, Camden and Holt distribution had grown, on paper at least. Vanessa had been promoted twice more, eventually taking the title of Chief Revenue Officer, a role her father created specifically so she'd have a seat at the executive table. She'd told the story of Daniel's departure so many times, at so many leadership retreats, that it had calcified into legend. The quiet salesman who just couldn't keep up once real leadership arrived, who wasn't built for where the company was going. Nobody in the room ever corrected her, because nobody in the room had any idea that the story was about to end very differently than she'd written it. What Vanessa didn't know, what almost nobody at Camden and Holt knew, was that 18 months after Daniel walked out of that building, Camden and Holt had quietly restructured its debt through a private equity firm during a rough stretch, following a failed West Coast expansion Vanessa herself had championed. That restructuring had required a new majority investor, one who came in through a holding company with a name so generic it drew no attention. Ashcombe Partners. The paperwork had been handled entirely through lawyers. Richard Camden, desperate to save the company his father built, had signed away 61% ownership without ever once meeting the man behind Ashcombe Partners face to face. He'd assumed, reasonably enough, that it was simply an anonymous investment group. He had no reason to assume otherwise. And so for 3 years, Richard Camden had been running a company he no longer actually controlled, reporting quarterly numbers to a board seat he'd never seen filled, without knowing that the silent majority owner of Camden and Holt Distribution was the same man he'd once let his daughter humiliate out the front door. Daniel, whose real legal name, the one on the folder that had followed him since before he'd ever set foot in that building, was Daniel Reyes Whitfield, heir to a logistics and freight empire his own estranged father had built, and later left him control of after a reconciliation none of his co-workers had ever heard about, had spent those 3 years doing exactly what he'd always done best, working quietly, precisely, and without announcing a single thing until the numbers were undeniable. He hadn't taken over Camden and Holt out of revenge. He'd taken it over because it was a well-run mid-sized logistics company with strong regional contracts and a workforce full of people like Marcus, the young rep who'd once whispered his sympathy under his breath, people who deserved better leadership than they were getting. Daniel simply hadn't corrected anyone's assumptions about who was behind Ashcombe Partners because he wanted to see, with his own eyes, exactly how the company would run itself once he was no longer there to prop it up. The answer, over 3 years, had been a slow, steady decline dressed up in confident language. Client retention had dropped from Daniel's peak of 94% to just 61%. 2 of his old accounts, the largest in the company's history, had quietly moved their business elsewhere after Vanessa's team failed to renew contracts on time. Mistakes buried in board reports under phrases like market softness and strategic realignment. The commission restructuring Vanessa had pushed through had driven out 4 more of the company's top performers within a year, each departure quietly absorbed and explained away. Camden and Holt was by any honest measure a company coasting on the fumes of work Daniel Reyes had done years earlier, still being spent down long after he'd left the building. The reveal happened at the company's annual shareholder and board meeting, held in the same conference room where Richard had once announced Vanessa's promotion to a round of applause. This time, the room was tenser. Quarterly numbers were down again, and for the first time, Richard had been forced to inform the board that Ashcombe Partners, the majority owner, had requested to finally send a representative in person, rather than simply reviewing reports remotely, as they had for 3 years. Vanessa, seated at the head of the table beside her father, spent the morning rehearsing a presentation designed to spin the declining numbers as a temporary dip before an inevitable rebound. She had slides, she had confidence, she had absolutely no idea what was coming. At 10:47 a.m., the conference room door opened, and Daniel Reyes Whitfield walked in wearing a suit that fit exactly the way his old Navy button-down used to. Clean, unremarkable, chosen for function rather than display. For nearly 4 full seconds, nobody in the room reacted because nobody recognized him. Then Marcus, who'd stayed on and was now sitting near the back as the newly promoted senior account manager, went pale and half rose from his chair. Richard's expression shifted from polite confusion to something colder and more uncertain, and Vanessa, mid-sentence, clicker in hand, simply stopped talking, staring at the man, walking calmly toward the head of the table, as though she were trying to reconcile two people who couldn't possibly be the same one. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He set a single folder on the table, the same careful, precise habit he'd carried through 5 years of client meetings, and said that he was there representing Ashcombe Partners as majority owner of Camden and Holt Distribution, and that he'd asked to attend in person this quarter because the numbers no longer reflected the company he remembered. Richard's face drained of color as the pieces assembled themselves in real time. Vanessa's clicker slipped from her hand and clattered against the table. What followed wasn't shouting. It was worse than shouting. It was Daniel calmly walking the board through 3 years of declining metrics, comparing them line by line against his own final quarter as an employee. Numbers he'd once produced from a cubicle by a copier that jammed twice a day. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Every board member in that room could do the math themselves. Watching a woman who'd once dismissed him as needing a fresh face sit frozen while the man she'd pushed out laid out, with devastating precision, exactly how much the company had lost by losing him. Richard, to his credit, said almost nothing. He simply sat very still, staring at the folder in front of him, understanding, 3 years too late, precisely whose desk his daughter had once asked a man to clear. The board meeting that had begun as a routine quarterly review ended, 4 hours later, with a vote that Daniel neither pushed for nor needed to. By early afternoon, the board, many of whom had spent years quietly frustrated by Vanessa's leadership, but too intimidated by the Camden name to say so, moved to restructure executive leadership entirely. Vanessa Camden was removed from her role as Chief Revenue Officer by a vote of 7-2, her father among the 2 dissenting, his voice by then too shaken to carry much weight in a room he no longer controlled. Richard remained chairman in title for another 6 months, a courtesy Daniel insisted on out of respect for the company Richard's own father had built. But the real authority in the building had shifted permanently, and everyone in it knew exactly where it had gone. Vanessa left the building that same afternoon, escorted not out of cruelty but out of the simple procedural necessity that follows any executive removal, her badge deactivated before she'd even reached the parking garage, the same quiet, procedural ending she'd once arranged for someone else without a second thought. She would later tell people, at whatever rooms would still listen, that she'd been the victim of a hostile takeover, that the new owner had engineered her downfall out of some kind of grudge. Almost nobody who'd actually sat in that boardroom believed her, because almost nobody who'd sat in that boardroom had forgotten the sight of 3 years of declining numbers laid out in a folder next to 3 years of numbers that had once made the company thrive. The truth didn't need Daniel's help to spread. It spread the way truth tends to when it's finally allowed room to breathe. Daniel didn't take Vanessa's old office. He didn't take any office at all, not at first. He spent his first 2 months back at Camden and Holt, walking the floor, learning names, sitting in on client calls, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding relationships that had been allowed to erode. Marcus, the young rep who'd once whispered his sympathy under his breath, was promoted to director of key accounts within the year, not because of any personal favor, but because his numbers, once given the freedom Daniel had fought to restore to the commission structure, spoke for themselves. 2 of the major clients who'd left during Vanessa's tenure were personally called by Daniel, not with an apology exactly, but with an honest account of what had happened and an invitation to come back and see for themselves. Both did. Richard Camden, in the months that followed, aged the way men do when they realize a mistake wasn't a single decision but a slow accumulation of small ones, each easy to justify at the time. He and Daniel had one long, difficult conversation in the weeks after the board meeting. Not an argument, but something closer to a reckoning. Richard asked, more than once, why Daniel had never simply told him who he really was, why he'd let 5 years pass in a cubicle, instead of walking in the front door with his real name on the first day. Daniel's answer was simple, and it was the same answer he gave anyone who asked afterward. Hadn't wanted a company handed to him because of who his father was. He'd wanted, for once in his life, to know whether he was actually good at something, or whether people had just always been polite to the name attached to him. Camden and Holt had given him the answer. It just hadn't given him the respect that should have come with it, not until the truth forced the issue. For Mia, now 11, very little actually changed. She still packed her own backpack most mornings, still argued that sandwiches tasted better cut into triangles, still had a father who left the office by 4:45 whenever he could manage it, because some habits, once built out of necessity, are worth keeping even after the necessity disappears. She knew, in the vague way children know things about their parents' work, that something significant had happened at her dad's job, that people talked about him differently now, that a woman named Vanessa had been in the news for a little while, that her father had gotten some kind of big promotion. She didn't know the full story, and Daniel wasn't in a hurry to tell her all of it. He simply wanted her to grow up understanding one thing clearly, that the work you do quietly, without asking for credit, doesn't disappear just because nobody's clapping for it. Eventually, someone notices. Eventually, it matters. A year after the boardroom reveal, Camden and Holt's client retention had climbed back above 90%, and the company had brought on 3 of the largest contracts in its history, deals that, notably, Daniel closed personally, the same way he always had, quietly and without a press release. He kept a small, unremarkable office near the back of the floor, close enough to the same jamming copier he'd worked beside for 5 years, because he'd found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred it there. He still wore navy button-downs, he still packed lunches before sunrise. The only real difference, if you look closely enough, was that his name was back on the client directory, where it had always belonged, and where, this time, nobody was foolish enough to try removing it. Vanessa Camden, for her part, eventually found work at a smaller firm 2 states away, in a role considerably less senior than the one she'd once held, though by all accounts a more honest fit for what she'd actually earned, rather than what her last name had once guaranteed her. Whether she ever fully understood what her father's and her own mistake had actually cost the family is hard to say. People rarely do, right away. It tends to take years and a fair amount of quiet reflection to recognize that the person you dismissed as unremarkable was simply choosing, for reasons entirely his own, not to remind you who he really was. That's the part of this story worth sitting with long after the credits roll. How many people in your own life might be carrying more than they've ever shown you? More skill, more history, more quiet resilience than you've bothered to notice, because it was easier not to look closely. Daniel Reyes never needed anyone in that building to know his last name. He needed them to recognize his work. It took 3 years, a boardroom, and a folder full of numbers for that recognition to finally arrive. But arrive it did, and when it did, nothing about that company or the people who ran it was ever the same again.